Okay, so we're here at COP26, just outside the main plenary room of the COP, and we're here as Scientists Warning Europe, really promoting our new World Scientists Warning of climate emergency and the Warnings into Action paper that came out only 8 days ago. Within that action paper, it talks about the 6 main stressors related to the planet, what we have to do. That's related to nature, to food, to energy, to economy, to population and to short-lived pollutants. But it also addresses what should be being done at a community and parish level by the leadership there, and at local authority level as well as at national government level. Now, I'd be delighted if you two would be able to introduce yourselves and then give us a little view of what you think should be being done at local government level in relation to the climate crisis.
I'm Marianne Overton, Vice Chairman of Local Government Association, and we feel that the local government is absolutely at the heart. We are closest to the people, we are closest to actually what's going on. So we do see that it is very much our job to do 2 things. One is to encourage local people to take up the mantle and really drive forward positively in their own lives, but also to support decisions made by local government that will have a significant impact on climate change. So it's both aspects, and the other part of what we're doing as local government is doing a baseline survey and actually carefully calculating the impact of what our councils are doing, and then working out trajectory and how we're going to get there and how we're going to fund that. Most of us have got net zero by 2030 in our agendas. So it's partly what we're doing for ourselves, but the point I've been making, which I think is catching hold, is what the decisions that we make and the impact of those decisions, and that can be very far-reaching. So we do have a responsibility also for the impact of our whole communities and the carbon footprint of our whole communities, and that's really what we're working very hard on.
Well, that's brilliant. And Marianne, there are some councils who are not quite as ambitious as the 2030 target, which I know the majority are, and they're literally saying, we'll just stick with doing what the government's doing. Do we think that's good enough, or do we think they should up their game?
It's clear that it is not good enough, and that is all of the evidence which is coming out of all of the scientists and your report as well. It's perfectly clear that what we're doing is if we continue on that route, it is a route to disaster. We really have to up our game.
Fantastic. And Amelia, what do you think that local government should be doing?
So Amelia Womack, Deputy Leader of the Green Party, and in local government, I really echo a lot of what Marianne said. It's the place that's closest to the people, and let's face it, that's where, when the climate emergency is hitting communities, councils need to react as well. So there are twofold to this: the adaptation, mitigation work that needs to be happening on flood prevention, making sure that we're preventing wildfires, and that will only happen if we reduce our carbon emissions and stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. So climate emergencies have been declared across the country. It was a Green in Bristol who declared the first climate emergency in Europe. And it's important to be setting the framework of how we operate, setting the parameters of what we need to do. And it's interesting because some councils, as you said, have those longer dates with a lack of ambition and no strategy to getting there. But we see, obviously from a Green perspective, I see the work of Greens putting in place that basic policy, whether that's York Greens putting in place insulation schemes into their community, Greens in Kirklees who have solar panels on the homes of the poorest members of their community to ensure that they're tackling fuel poverty while also ensuring that we reduce carbon emissions. And in Herefordshire, Greens giving free weekend travel to make the greenest option, the cheapest and easiest, most convenient option for everyone. And these are ways that we can really change how we work on a community basis and ensure that we are changing those frameworks. So I think there's a high level of thinking about climate in all of the work that we do, but also those specific policies that means that people can relate to what climate policy means to their lives.
And that's great, and I have to say that first climate emergency started a complete torrent of things which has actually taken us to a much better place than we might have been otherwise. It's not just climate, of course, it's also biodiversity and nature. And one of the things in terms of local council work for me is we're still cutting down trees, mature trees, because our planning system is still proposing, or let's say in favour of buildings rather than in favour of the natural environment and of the trees. And now we know that we have to adapt, particularly to heat waves like those coming from Canada, and the trees we need in the ground. Have either of you got any suggestions, I'll come to you first, Amelia, about how we might solve this area where we're focusing on buildings before we're focusing on trees and biodiversity?
Politics is all about priorities, and if we prioritise nature, then we will see the frame in which we operate change. And I've seen arguments happen about whether we need to keep a mature tree or put a cycle lane in place, and then Greens coming along and saying, well, we can have both if we work this way. And I think that if we, when you look at a lot of the work that's been happening on how we change the way we think about nature, so things like a law of ecosystem, or giving nature rights, then it means that we change the way we think about planning and change the way that we operate. So it's all about priorities, and if you have your nature as your priority, you'll start to think differently about how you work and operate, and ensure that you're creating a balance of ensuring that we do have that infrastructure in place, in this case, like in my example, cycle lanes, but also ensuring that we're protecting those mature trees, because I feel like we've lost a connection to nature over time. And I've travelled a lot of the UK, and actually I've seen a lot of people very passionate about their trees and what they mean to them. In Darlington, there was a big campaign, because as you drive into Darlington, there's this canopy of trees that used to be there that people used to say, it's these trees that remind me that I've arrived home. And actually we forget about some of those basic connections that we do have. And I hope that there's a point, David Attenborough has reinvigorated that connection for so many people, sure. But I hope that people do begin to find that connection of what nature does mean to them. Hopefully now and in the future.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And Marianne, what would you think about that in relation to trees and biodiversity?
Absolutely vital, and I think it's really important that we look at it holistically. We are actually trying to improve the environment as a whole, and I think there is I worry that some of the things that we are fighting for get hijacked and turned into somebody else's agenda. So, for example, with biodiversity net gain, we're hoping for a 10% it will be coming into the legislation. But I have seen applications coming through where they cut down a whole woodland and plant a little bit of wildflower seed and say that's a 10% net gain. That must be fine then. Absolutely not. We are not looking at it holistically enough. We have to look at the real situation, and it isn't just about ticking boxes. And that's what worries me with government, and I really hope that they will change the view away from ticking boxes and actually give this a local control over planning. There is too much of a temptation for it to be about developers and what developers want. Let's tick that. Much thought about centralising those decisions. We have to make sure that we can have local councils in full control of local planning, and then answerable and accountable to their residents, which we are.
Absolutely. Sorry.
Can I just add to that as well? Because I think it's really interesting being at an international event and hearing different stories. There often are shared problems that we don't realise, and that issue of cutting down mature trees and planting some new trees that don't always survive because they're not part of the ecosystem in the same way as a mature tree is, and are obviously feel stress in a very different way. I was talking to someone from India, and she was talking about how they cut down trees and forests, plant kind of 10% new trees to replace the mature trees, and how it's simply not working. And sometimes it's really incredible to be at events like this and understand that there is an international problem. What we see in our very local communities is actually being replicated in communities around the world.
Yes, and I think in our own area, one of the problems we have is that even in our local plans, trying to protect biodiversity and trees, we've got a requirement for buildings that when there's a new building development, there must be 25% canopy cover, but in 25 years. So they're allowing developers to cut down the trees, then plant trees that we're not going to see the adaptation effects of in terms of, and then mitigating any problems like Canadian heat waves for 25 years. And as far as Scientists Warning Europe's concerned, I'm consistently saying in Buckinghamshire, we haven't got 25 years to wait for it. I think then to bring us back a bit to COP26, with the Currently, the world seems to be fixated on 2050, and effectively 2050 is a politically negotiated agreement in the Paris Accord in which we've been shoehorning science in to say that we can still get there and stay under 1.5 or 2 degrees. We're at Scientists Warning Europe consistently saying it's not going to be good enough. The recent letter we issued to Boris Johnson and to Mario Draghi just before signed by 28 of the world's top scientists said 2030 or as near as possible. Now, before I comment on what Scientists Warning Europe would like to see out of COP26, I'd like to, thinking of the UK's attitude, what are we expecting from Boris Johnson's last speech and what the UK may be doing at COP26? Marianne, would you like to go first?
The speech had many fine words from the UK, which we can all support. The new IPCC has said very clearly that we must have immediate and sustained reduction in carbon production. What we actually need from the government next is to see those fine words turned into genuine legislation and accompanying funding. And I don't just mean lots more of one thing. You know, there's a tendency to just have lots more turbines and still have 300,000 new houses new dwellings every year. 300,000 new dwellings every year does not compute if you are also trying to reduce your carbon footprints. The two do not go together. So what we actually need from this government is a much more drive, not towards economic growth, which seems to be the mantra, but what we actually want is economic well-being, and we want well-being and for people. And that's much more important at the core of our whole thinking. So I would like to see a change in the thinking towards the well-being of our population, and also making sure that those fine words are turned into real funding and real legislation.
So essentially, actually, it's putting our money where our mouth is and getting the funding behind the actually pretty good rhetoric that Boris Johnson had in his first speech. Let's see what happens at the end. Amelia.
I think that was really beautifully put. And I think, I'd like to have confidence that we're going to have bold conclusions from this and our Prime Minister will take action. But I've just been in this plenary room and I heard Alex Sharma say that coal belongs in the past, while completely not taking action on the fact that we have new coal mines coming up in Cumbria. We have new oil fields. We're investing internationally in gas. And I feel like there are a lot of warm words because no leader wanted to be the leader that seemed to fail at this negotiation. And so, even when we're seeing pledges of 2070, I am taking from India, I am taking some hope from that, in that, the era of climate denial is at least over and there is political will to at least look like you're doing something. But I'm not convinced that we'll see the actions in place that need to take place. So if I was Prime Minister, I would put in place a carbon tax and cancel the 27 billion a year road building programme and invest that into a sustainable infrastructure. I'd be working to insulate homes and ensure that we had renewable energy so that we were reducing the impact of geopolitical situations that create energy shocks here in the UK and mean that we can provide cheaper community focused energy. There are so many policies that we know about. My background's in science as well. We have known this for decades. And it's not news on how you reduce your carbon emissions, how you sink out carbon emissions through trees, restoring peatlands. We can give you the entire manifesto of how to do this. It just needs the political will. And one thing I see around the world is I've been doing this job for 7 years, and at the beginning, lots of people were saying, what comes first? The movement of people, of business, or of governments? And I'd say right now, people who are championing change because they are on the front lines of the climate emergency. Someone from India that I was saying about her village being flooded as a result of storm activity. We've seen wildfires in Australia, America, Greece. The climate emergency is here and citizens are on the front line of that. People are moving. I see businesses moving because it's about risk to their company and actually risk to their bottom line. They're not necessarily doing this because it's the right thing to do. They're doing it because it's about the long-term viability of their businesses. And the group that is lagging behind is government. and they are failing everybody else because all business wants is a parameter and framework to operate in that they will know will be consistent for the next 20, 30 years. If we were very clear about becoming net carbon zero by 2030, that would set a clear parameter. If we put in place a carbon tax, that would set a clear motivation for what we're trying to achieve. And so I just want government to have the political will, Boris Johnson to have the political will to take genuine action and catch up with the rest of us, because the science demands nothing else, nothing less.
That's fantastic, and it's quite interesting actually, and if I don't mind keeping you for another 2 minutes, I think this is so very, very interesting, because none of us here are conservatives, so, but let's also now say that that's not the point, because climate's not about a party political issue in any way whatsoever, so we need the action for all of us. And if we're to give advice, then what do we need them to do? Well, at Scientists Warning Europe, and the letter that went out recently to the two Prime Ministers is very much suggesting everything you've been saying. We're not on the game, we're not going fast enough. Effectively, we're running a marathon, and we're trying to break the world record. And the leading pack is a big pack that are all running together, but they're off the pace. And they're never going to break that world record. So what we need is for somebody to break from the front and have a go at breaking the world record. Even if they fail, they're going to have a go at it. Now, we've just talked about both the first climate emergency declaration, which was coming out of the Green Party. We've talked about the 2030s, where the majority of councils have selected it, some for the community, some for the council itself. What about if we have Boris Johnson coming out on the last day, tearing up his speech as he goes up there and saying, right, Britain is going to 2030 net zero. Do you think he could do that? Do you think we as a country could do that? Would you support it?
It would need to be really carefully calculated. I mean, I would certainly support it as a principle, obviously, as I have done in my own council. I actually proposed that, and we did pass it unanimously. So it is about having the will, as we've said, and I think the statement would be good, but it would have to be backed up, because it would be no good saying it and then just falling by the wayside. We want to see real action that is definitely aimed at the right solutions. It's got to be real.
Terrific. Thank you, Marianne.
Ambition is a powerful thing. It put a man on the moon. It's changed the course of history on many occasions, and I think that bold ambition is what we need right now. And I'd like to take your marathon metaphor, because I think that there are people who are breaking away. We've seen incredible speeches from Barbados, the reality of people's lives in the Maldives. It's just that it's almost like the pack can't see them. And even though their commitments are to net carbon zero, and like I know that Barbados at the moment are struggling because of a lack of tourism, that has changed their finances and their ability to do things, we really need to be taking a lot of responsibility for that as well, and to be not only catching up but enabling them to continue with their momentum as well. So big ambition is important, and we are able to change things overnight. We saw that from COVID. We saw that there's, when you look at the climate emergency, it's calculated it will cost $100 billion a year to ensure that we put a Green New Deal in place to reduce our carbon emissions. And that's a lot of money, but it cost $3 billion a year during COVID to ensure that we were protecting people. And this is what the Conservatives, I don't think, see. This is really a basic risk management strategy. And in 2007, Lord Stern said it's going to, the longer we take to put action in place, the more expensive it will be. And so he needs to take action now, because this is just, a very basic risk management, cost kind of efficiency exercise. And if you want to put it into the framework of economics, the arguments are there for quick and rapid action that mean we are tackling this huge problem.
Okay, terrific. Just one last quick comment then. So I think we would all support Boris Johnson if he took a 2030 net zero target. Do you think everybody else would? Do you think the electorate would?
They would, if they could see that it was going to work.
Right.
The problem at the moment with this business of the economy seems to be based, their books only seem to balance. If you keep building, well, that's not going to work. We need a different kind of economy. We need to be much more focused on actually using less and making things in balance. And if we can get that far, we'll still have a huge quality of life, terrific quality of life, but it just doesn't have to depend on a consuming society where we always need more of everything and growth of everything. We actually just need things in balance.
Absolutely right. A last comment then, Amelia, from you.
So I think that we've already seen in polling that even in the red wall areas, the historic red wall areas especially, people support environmental policy. We see strong support for a carbon tax. We're seeing that those green policies are supported across the UK. So yeah, I think that people will be there. And as I've said before, I travel the country, I speak to a lot of people, and frankly, all people want is the greenest option to be the cheapest and easiest option, and they don't understand why the default is causing problems locally and internationally, and they want government to put that frame in place, so the default just is the right thing to be doing.
And they want true leadership. Let's hope we see it from the British government. So thank you very much, Amelia. Thank you very much, Marianne.
Thank you.